Kyle Warren had always been the kind of man who dealt with problems head-on. As a former combat medic, he had learned to operate under pressure, to think quickly, and to keep his emotions in check, no matter how chaotic the situation around him became. Life in the military had shaped him into someone who could remain calm while stitching up a soldier in the middle of gunfire, someone who could assess injuries with detached precision while the world crumbled around him. But after years of service, after witnessing too much death and feeling the weight of decisions no one should ever have to make, he had finally left it all behind, hoping to find a sense of peace in civilian life. That, of course, was easier said than done. The transition had not been smooth. Adjusting to life outside the military was like trying to walk on legs that no longer felt like his own. The world moved differently, and people operated on rules that seemed trivial compared to the life or death urgency he had been trained to navigate. Crowds made him uneasy, unexpected noises sent his pulse skyrocketing, and moments of stillness felt foreign, as if something was always about to happen. But through it all, there had been one constant source of stability. Major. Major wasn't just a dog. He was a highly trained service animal, specifically assigned to Kyle to help him manage the lingering effects of his service. Where others saw just a large, black German shepherd with intelligent eyes and a disciplined stance, Kyle saw the one thing that kept him tethered to reality. Major could sense the shifts in his breathing, the tightening of his muscles, the subtle signs that signaled an oncoming panic attack or an episode of disorientation. He was trained to intervene, to apply pressure against Kyle's body to ground him, to redirect him when he became lost in spiraling thoughts, and to ensure that the world remained navigable, even on days when it felt impossible. For 3 years, Major had been by his side. He had been with him during the difficult transition into civilian life, through sleepless nights, and through the moments when Kyle doubted whether he could ever truly reintegrate into society. And now, at 36, Kyle had managed to build something close to a normal life. He had a small but steady job working with a veterans rehabilitation program, helping others like himself find their footing in a world that often felt alien to them. He had bought a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, a place where he could breathe, where there were no unexpected noises, no chaotic unpredictability. He had thought, perhaps naively, that this would be a place where he could finally exist without feeling like he was constantly on guard. That illusion had shattered almost as soon as he met Karen Lawson. Karen was the kind of neighbor who believed that everything and everyone around her should adhere to her personal sense of order. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years and had developed an iron grip on its social fabric, acting as an unofficial enforcer of what she considered appropriate behavior. She was the type of woman who filed complaints about Christmas decorations staying up too long, who scrutinized every car parked on the street, and who took it upon herself to dictate what was and wasn't acceptable. And from the moment she laid eyes on Major, it had been clear that she viewed him as a problem. At first, it had been subtle. Disapproving looks from across the street, a pointed glance whenever she saw Kyle walking Major through the neighborhood, a slight tightening of her lips whenever they passed one another. Then the comments began. "That's quite a large dog," she had said once, voice laced with something just shy of accusation. Another time she had casually mentioned, some people are uncomfortable around animals like that. Kyle had dismissed it at first. He had dealt with worse, had faced people who judged without understanding, and he knew that no matter what he said, some people would always be suspicious of a large, working dog. But Karen wasn't just some passive observer with a distaste for service animals. She escalated. She began asking other neighbors if they felt safe knowing there was a military-trained attack dog in the area. She spoke in hushed, concerned tones about how Kyle had a history, implying things without saying them outright. She called animal control twice, filing complaints that Major was a danger, even though he had never shown aggression to anyone. Both times, the complaints were dismissed when officers found nothing wrong, but Karen was persistent. She left printed articles about dog attacks in Kyle's mailbox, as if trying to convince him that his own companion was a threat. She went to neighborhood meetings and brought up the issue of large, aggressive breeds, making it clear who she was referring to. Kyle had ignored her. He had learned long ago not to waste energy on people like her. Major was registered, trained, and legally protected as a service animal. No amount of passive-aggressive complaints or veiled threats could change that. He had assumed that, eventually, Karen would grow tired of her crusade and find some other grievance to fixate on. He had been wrong. One evening, as Kyle sat on his porch watching Major calmly lounge in the yard, he noticed movement across the street. Karen was standing at her window, watching him, phone in hand. He didn't think much of it. She had always been the type to monitor everything happening around her, but something about the way she held herself made his skin prickle with unease. Then, a few days later, he noticed another oddity. The side gate leading to his backyard had been slightly ajar that morning, despite him knowing he had locked it the night before. At first, he had told himself it was nothing, maybe just the wind, maybe his own forgetfulness. But as the days passed, little things kept happening. He found his trash cans knocked over, but no sign of an animal rummaging through them. The back motion sensor light was triggered multiple times in the middle of the night, but when he checked, there was no one there. It was enough to put him on edge, to make him start paying closer attention. Then, one morning, everything changed. Kyle stepped out into his yard, calling for Major to come inside for breakfast, but the yard was empty. His stomach clenched. He whistled, then called again, louder this time. Nothing. Panic surged through his veins as he scanned the perimeter, searching for any sign of movement. The gate. The gate was wide open this time. His breath came sharp and fast as he ran forward, eyes darting for tracks, any clue as to what had happened. That was when he noticed that the lock on the gate had been changed. Not broken. Not cut. Changed. The padlock securing it was not the one he had installed. Someone had removed his and replaced it with a new one. Someone had taken the time to cover their tracks, to make it look as if nothing had happened. But Kyle knew. His dog was gone, and someone had made sure he couldn't follow. Kyle stood frozen at the sight of the unfamiliar lock, his breath coming in sharp, controlled exhales as his mind worked through what he was seeing. There was no denying it. Someone had come onto his property, had taken Major, and had done so with enough planning and precision to cover their tracks. The realization sent a pulse of adrenaline through his veins, but he fought to keep his emotions in check. Panicking wouldn't bring Major back. Losing control wouldn't help him figure out what had happened. He forced himself to take a step back, to assess everything like he would have in the field: observe, analyze, act. First, he checked the ground near the gate, scanning for footprints, tire marks, any sign of forced entry. The soil near the latch was disturbed, and the grass showed faint signs of compression, as if someone had stood there for an extended period of time. The fact that the lock had been replaced rather than broken suggested that the person responsible hadn't been in a rush. They had expected him to take time before realizing Major was gone. That meant they knew his schedule, his habits. It wasn't some random theft. This was planned. His gut twisted as he reached for the lock, testing it. It was new, cheap, hastily placed, and clearly not meant to last. He didn't have the key, obviously, but that was irrelevant. He stepped back and kicked it hard, the force sending vibrations up his leg. The latch bent slightly but didn't break. He kicked again, this time putting all his strength into it. The lock snapped, the gate swinging open with a protesting creak. His heart pounded as he stepped into the yard, scanning for anything out of place. No blood, no tufts of fur, no sign of a struggle. That was good. It meant Major hadn't been injured, at least not here. Kyle moved quickly, retracing the steps he had taken the night before. He had let Major out into the yard late, as he always did before going to bed. There had been nothing unusual then, no strange sounds, no signs of anyone lurking. But someone had come in the night, had entered his property without setting off any alarms. That alone made his skin crawl. He had always been careful, always hyper-aware of his surroundings, yet someone had managed to slip past him. The thought filled him with a slow, simmering rage. His first instinct was to call the police, but he hesitated. He knew how these things went. They would take his report, maybe send a patrol car to do a half-hearted search, but ultimately it was just a missing dog to them. They wouldn't treat it as a crime, at least not at first. He needed more than just a gut feeling and a broken lock if he wanted them to take it seriously. Forcing himself to stay logical, he pulled out his phone and opened the contacts list. There were a few people he could call, people he had worked with in the past, people who knew how to get information when it mattered. But before he went down that road, he needed to exhaust the obvious options first. He called the local animal shelters, giving them Major's description, making sure they flagged his file so that if anyone tried to turn him in, they would know he was stolen. Then he called the nearest veterinary clinics, asking if anyone had brought in a large German Shepherd within the last few hours. No one had. The next step was the neighborhood itself. He went door to door, knocking, keeping his voice steady as he explained the situation. Most of his neighbors were sympathetic but unhelpful. No one had seen anything. A few of them glanced over at Karen's house when he mentioned Major was missing, but when he pressed, they only offered vague, uncomfortable shrugs that set off every alarm bell in his head. If multiple people instinctively thought of her, then there was a reason for it. He walked up to her house, standing in front of the door for a long moment before finally knocking. He knew she would answer. Karen never ignored an opportunity to make her presence known. True to form, the door swung open after only a few seconds, and there she stood, her expression neutral, but her eyes gleaming with something he couldn't quite place. "Well," she said, leaning slightly against the doorframe, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Kyle didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Major is missing," he said flatly. "Someone came into my yard last night, cut the lock, and took him." Karen blinked, feigning surprise. "Oh my, that's just awful," she said, her voice dripping with exaggerated concern. "A big, dangerous dog like that wandering around? That's a real safety issue." Kyle's jaw tightened. He didn't wander off. He was taken. Someone went through a lot of trouble to make it look like he wasn't. Karen tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And you think I would know something about that?" "You've been complaining about him for months," Kyle said, filing false reports, trying to convince people he's a threat. "I don't think it's a stretch to assume you had something to do with this." Karen's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Oh, Kyle dear, you can't go around making accusations without proof." "That's how rumors start," she teased softly. "And you wouldn't want people getting the wrong idea about you now, would you?" There it was. The veiled threat. Kyle knew what she was doing. She wanted him to lose his temper, to react, to give her something she could use against him. He wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, he held her gaze for a long, silent moment, then exhaled slowly, forcing himself to step back. "If I find out you had anything to do with this," he said, his voice level, "there won't be anywhere you can hide from the consequences." Karen's expression flickered, just for a fraction of a second, before she recovered. "I hope you find your dog, Kyle," she said sweetly. "Truly." He turned and walked away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had been in enough high-stakes situations to recognize when someone was bluffing and when they weren't. Karen wasn't bluffing. She knew something. By the time he got home, the anger had settled into something colder, sharper. He sat down at his desk, opening his laptop and pulling up a notepad. If the police weren't going to take this seriously, he would make sure they had no choice. He started compiling everything he had: Major's registration papers, proof of ownership, details about Karen's previous complaints, the false reports she had made, and a list of people who had heard her talking about how she wanted the dog gone. Then he opened his browser and searched for local surveillance cameras. The city had installed several at major intersections, and some businesses had their own security feeds. It was a long shot, but if Major had been transported out of the area, there was a chance he had been caught on camera. His phone vibrated, and he grabbed it instinctively. The number was blocked. He answered, keeping his voice steady. A man's voice, low and unrecognizable, spoke on the other end. "Forget the dog," the voice said. "Move on." The line went dead. Kyle stared at the screen for a long moment before placing the phone down with deliberate care. This wasn't just about a stolen dog anymore. Someone wanted him to back off. That meant he was getting close. Kyle set the phone down slowly, his pulse steady but his mind sharpening into something cold and precise. The moment he heard that voice, a part of him had already switched gears. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute anymore. This wasn't just Karen being a nuisance, filing complaints and spreading rumors. Someone had gone through the trouble of stealing his service dog, replacing the lock on his gate to cover their tracks, and now they were warning him to let it go. That meant one thing: whoever took Major wasn't some petty thief looking for a quick payday. They had an agenda, and they expected Kyle to be scared off. That was their first mistake. He sat motionless for a long moment, forcing his thoughts into order. The voice had been deliberately distorted, likely through some cheap voice-altering app, but the phrasing mattered. Forget the dog. Move on. That meant they knew he was looking, and more importantly, they knew he wasn't stopping. That suggested surveillance. Someone was keeping tabs on his movements. That didn't surprise him. He had already sensed eyes on him over the last few days, subtle shifts in the way people behaved when he walked past. The occasional parked car that lingered just a little too long. He had spent years honing his ability to recognize patterns, to separate coincidence from intention, and now his instincts were screaming that this was the latter. He needed more than just gut feeling. He needed evidence, and he needed to force whoever was behind this into making a mistake. That meant changing his approach. His first call was to a former Army buddy, James Hart, who had gone into private security after leaving the service. Hart picked up on the second ring, his voice sharp with recognition. "Kyle? Thought you were done with trouble. Turns out trouble wasn't done with me," Kyle replied. "I need a favor." "Name it." Kyle explained the situation in clipped, efficient detail, keeping emotion out of it. Hart listened without interrupting, then exhaled sharply. "Damn, you got someone rattled. Looks that way. You need me to run some plates? Pull footage?" "Both if you can." Kyle knew Hart had connections in law enforcement and the private sector that could get him access to surveillance feeds faster than any official request. "There's been a black SUV hanging around my street. No plates. I need to know who it belongs to. Also, I want any traffic camera footage from last night. If Major was taken by car, I need to see where he went." Hart didn't hesitate. "I'll see what I can dig up. Give me a few hours." Kyle thanked him and ended the call, his mind already moving to the next step. If someone was watching him, he needed to watch them back. He retrieved the small GoPro-style camera he had used for training exercises and mounted it discreetly on the front porch, angling it to cover both the street and his driveway. It wasn't much, but if anyone came sniffing around again, he'd have something concrete to work with. Next, he took a drive around the neighborhood, moving methodically through side streets, checking for anything that felt out of place. It didn't take long before he spotted it, the same black SUV, parked just far enough from his house to avoid suspicion, but close enough to have a line of sight. The windows were tinted, and the engine was off. He drove past slowly, memorizing details: aftermarket rims, slight dent on the rear bumper, front grille covered in dust, but the body clean, recently washed except for that one area, suggesting a deliberate attempt to obscure identifying marks. Instead of stopping, he kept driving, turning down another street and pulling into a gas station. He parked near the air pump, using the reflection in the window to watch the SUV in the distance. It didn't move. That told him two things: whoever was inside wasn't there for surveillance training, and they weren't expecting him to take countermeasures. That was their second mistake. He stepped out of his truck, moving casually, pretending to check his tires while discreetly snapping a few photos of the SUV. Then, as if on cue, his phone buzzed again. "I've got something," Hart said. "Traffic cameras picked up a black van leaving your area around 3 a.m. No plates, but I managed to enhance the image. Looks like it's a rental. I'm pulling records now." Kyle exhaled. A rental van meant paperwork, which meant a trail. Whoever took Major had to return the vehicle at some point, and that would give him a name. "Anything on the SUV near my place?" "Not yet, but I'll keep looking." Kyle ended the call and slid back into his truck, considering his next move. He could wait, let Hart do the digging, hope the police finally took this seriously, but that wasn't good enough. Every hour that passed put Major in more danger. He needed to escalate things on his own terms. Instead of heading home, he drove straight to the nearest veterinary clinic, the same one he had called earlier. He walked in, noting the receptionist's wary expression when she recognized him. "Anything come in?" he asked. She hesitated, then glanced at her computer screen. "Actually, we did have someone call earlier, asking about procedures for re-registering a microchipped dog under a new owner." Kyle's pulse quickened. "What did they say exactly?" The receptionist frowned. They wanted to know if there was a way to remove an existing chip or change the ownership without the original owner being notified. That was all he needed to hear. "Did you get a name?" She hesitated again, but something in his expression made her check. "They used a fake-sounding one. John Smith." She shook her head. But the call came from a local number. Kyle forced himself to stay calm. That was useful. Burner phones were common, but if they had used a local number, there was a chance he could trace it. "Did they say anything else?" She nodded slowly. "They asked about sedation options for a large breed." A chill ran through him. Whoever had Major wasn't just trying to keep him quiet, they were planning to keep him drugged. Kyle thanked her and walked out, his mind racing. He had a van, a phone number, a pattern of movement, and a target. It wasn't enough to act on yet, but it was getting close. He checked his phone. No new messages. He considered his options, then made a decision. If they were watching him, he was going to give them something to see. Instead of going home, he drove to a parking lot and waited. Sure enough, within 20 minutes, the black SUV pulled into view, stopping at the far end, pretending not to watch him. Kyle smiled to himself. He had them right where he wanted them. Kyle sat motionless in his truck, his fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel as he watched the black SUV parked at the far end of the lot. He wasn't reckless, and he wasn't going to rush this. Whoever was in that vehicle had been following him for too long for it to be a coincidence. And the fact that they had chosen to stay put, rather than drive off the moment he stopped, told him everything he needed to know. They weren't just watching. They were waiting to see what he would do next. That meant they were either under orders, inexperienced, or arrogant enough to think he hadn't noticed them yet. That was their third mistake. He reached for his phone and fired off a quick message to Hart, sending him the SUV's location and a request to check local business security cameras. If these guys had been tailing him for this long, they had likely been caught on tape somewhere. Then, without breaking his casual posture, he adjusted his mirror slightly, giving him a better angle on the SUV without making it obvious that he was watching them. The sun had started to dip lower in the sky, stretching shadows across the pavement, and the glare bouncing off the windshields made it difficult to see inside. Instead of acting rashly, Kyle made a decision. He started the engine, pulled out of the parking space, and drove toward the exit, deliberately taking a route that would require him to pass right by them. The SUV didn't move at first, and for a moment he thought they were going to sit tight and pretend they weren't involved. But just as he turned onto the main road, he caught a glimpse of the driver shifting in his seat, then saw the unmistakable flicker of movement in his rearview mirror as the vehicle pulled out to follow. They weren't even trying to hide it now. Kyle took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. This was good. This meant they were invested. They wanted to keep him under surveillance because they were afraid he was getting too close, which meant he was getting too close. Instead of heading home, he took a different approach. He turned onto the freeway, weaving through traffic, testing their reaction. The SUV stayed with him, not too close, not too far, just lingering within a few car lengths. He kept his driving steady, nothing erratic, nothing that would make it obvious that he was leading them somewhere on purpose. Then, just when they might have thought he was heading towards some unknown destination, he took the next exit and entered a quiet industrial district, the kind of place that emptied out after business hours. He slowed down. The SUV hesitated. Then, finally, they made their move. The SUV accelerated, closing the distance between them. Kyle kept his hands steady on the wheel, heart hammering as he calculated every possible outcome. The road ahead curved sharply to the right, with an empty lot just beyond it. If they were planning something, this was where they would do it. He tightened his grip, readying himself for whatever came next. Then, just as expected, the SUV flashed its headlights twice. A signal. Kyle had seen enough roadside ambushes in his time to recognize the pattern. Someone wanted to box him in. He exhaled slowly, then reacted. Instead of slowing down, he gunned the accelerator at the last possible second, forcing his truck forward just as a second vehicle, a white van, lurched out from a side street in an attempt to cut him off. Tires screeched as the van skidded slightly, the driver overestimating how much space they had. Kyle didn't stop. He twisted the wheel hard, narrowly missing the van's front bumper as he forced his way past. The SUV behind him had to slam on the brakes to avoid a collision, and in the chaos, Kyle took his opportunity. He cut left, barreling down an alleyway between two warehouses, the truck's suspension protesting against the uneven pavement. He could hear the other vehicles scrambling behind him, but he had already calculated his route. At the end of the alley, he spun the wheel and pulled into an abandoned loading dock, killing the engine the moment he was out of sight. The second he was parked, he grabbed his phone and activated the camera feed from his porch, checking to see if anyone had made a move on his house in his absence. Nothing. Good. But he wasn't stupid enough to think they would just give up. He stayed still, heart pounding in his ears, listening for the sound of approaching footsteps or engines. The SUV and the van had been moving fast, and now that their plan had been disrupted, they would need a minute to regroup. That gave him just enough time to send Hart another message, detailing what had just happened. He attached the photos he had taken earlier and added one final note: "They're getting desperate." Seconds later, Hart responded, "They're amateurs if they thought that would work. Got a lead on the van rental. Sending you the address now." Kyle checked the location. It was on the other side of town, near a strip of old commercial buildings that had been partially abandoned over the last few years. That alone told him what he needed to know. Whoever had taken Major wasn't operating out of some high-tech underground network. They were working out of whatever cheap, disposable locations they could find. That meant they had vulnerabilities. He waited a few more minutes, listening, scanning the area, making sure no one was about to come charging down the alley with bad intentions. Then, once he was sure he was clear, he restarted the engine and took a different route back toward town, staying off the main roads, keeping his profile as low as possible. When he finally arrived near the rental location Hart had sent him, he didn't go in immediately. He parked a few blocks away, took his time scouting the perimeter, watching the foot traffic. The building itself was a small, run-down garage with faded signage, the kind of place that looked legitimate on paper but had all the hallmarks of a front. No security cameras, no visible staff inside, but two vehicles in the lot, one of which matched the blurry image from the traffic cam. Kyle leaned back in his seat, watching. Then, the front door opened. A man stepped out, average build, unremarkable, but something about the way he moved set Kyle's instincts on edge. He wasn't looking around casually. He was scanning, checking for something, checking for someone. Kyle's phone buzzed again. Hart. That van was rented under a fake ID, but the payment was linked to a burner account with a traceable transaction. "You're not going to believe this, but the account has ties to an illegal kennel, the kind that deals in fighting dogs. Kyle's stomach turned to ice. He had been prepared for a lot of possibilities. A simple revenge plot from Karen, a botched attempt to sell Major for a quick profit, even some kind of personal vendetta. But this was worse. If these people were connected to underground dogfighting rings, then Major wasn't just missing, he was in immediate danger. And Kyle was out of time. He stepped out of the truck and started walking toward the garage. Kyle moved with calculated precision. Every step toward the garage measured, his senses heightened to the smallest details. The way the man outside the building kept shifting his weight told him he was waiting for someone, maybe nervous, maybe just impatient, but either way, he wasn't relaxed. That was good. It meant whoever was inside wasn't expecting a confrontation just yet. Kyle had the element of surprise, but it wouldn't last long. He needed to get inside, assess the situation, and get Major out before things escalated beyond his control. He approached casually, keeping his posture loose, non-threatening, as if he belonged there, as if he was just another guy stopping by for business. The man at the entrance barely glanced at him at first, but then his eyes flicked up, scanning Kyle's face, and something in his expression tightened. He knew who Kyle was. That was all the confirmation Kyle needed. He didn't wait for the man to speak. Instead, he stepped in close fast, using the momentum of his approach to drive an elbow into the guy's ribs, knocking the breath out of him before he had a chance to react. The man staggered backward, hands instinctively going to his stomach, and Kyle followed up with a sharp shove against the door, forcing his way inside. The interior of the garage was dimly lit, the air thick with the stench of motor oil and something fouler beneath it. Kyle's eyes adjusted quickly, scanning the space. The front area was cluttered with car parts, stacked tires, and a rusted metal desk, but it was the noise that caught his attention first, a low, muffled whining, it coming from somewhere in the back. His gut clenched. He knew that sound. He had heard it too many times before in field hospitals, in the aftermath of bombings, when wounded soldiers fought to stay conscious. It was pain, exhaustion, fear. Major. Kyle moved before he could think, weaving through the cluttered space toward the sound. He could hear voices now, two of them, engaged in a low conversation just beyond a partially open door leading to another section of the building. He slowed, listening. Was supposed to be gone already. What the hell's the delay? Relax. The guy's spooked, said the dog's too well known. If we try to push him into a ring, someone's going to recognize him. Kyle felt a surge of ice-cold fury settle into his chest. They were talking about Major like he was nothing more than an asset, a piece of merchandise that had become inconvenient to move. His hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to stay controlled. He needed information before he acted. He leaned in closer, careful not to make a sound. So what's the plan now? There was a pause. Then, we wait. If that guy keeps looking, we dump the mutt and disappear. It's not worth the heat. Kyle didn't wait to hear more. He stepped back, took a deep breath, and then moved. He kicked the door open with enough force to send it slamming against the wall. The two men inside barely had time to react before Kyle was on them. The first one, the smaller of the two, reached for something, probably a weapon, but Kyle was faster. He grabbed the guy's wrist, twisting hard enough to send him sprawling, and then turned his focus to the second man, who had managed to get his bearings enough to throw a wild punch. Kyle ducked, pivoted, and drove a knee into the man's gut, sending him crashing against a metal shelf. Tools clattered to the ground as he groaned, sliding down. Kyle didn't waste time. He scanned the room and found what he was looking for, a set of metal crates stacked against the far wall. He crossed the space in 3 strides, shoving aside the smaller man, who was still gasping for breath on the floor, and unlatched the first crate. His heart nearly stopped when he saw Major inside, curled up, his normally alert eyes dull and unfocused. Kyle dropped to his knees, hands moving over Major's fur, checking for injuries. The dog was breathing, his chest rising and falling steadily, but he was sluggish, his reactions delayed. Kyle recognized the signs, immediately sedatives. They had drugged him, probably to keep him compliant during transport. Behind him, one of the men started to stir, but Kyle wasn't in the mood for another fight. He reached for a nearby wrench and hurled it at the guy's head with just enough force to knock him back down. Then, without wasting another second, he carefully lifted Major into his arms, ignoring the dull ache in his shoulders as he adjusted the dog's weight. He turned toward the exit, but just as he reached the door, he heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching outside. Reinforcements. Kyle moved quickly, shifting Major's weight as he pushed through the front of the garage. The man he had taken down earlier was still groaning on the floor, but Kyle ignored him, focusing instead on the approaching headlights cutting through the dim evening light. A black car, different from the SUV that had been tailing him earlier but no doubt connected. He needed to get out, now. Thinking fast, he spotted a set of keys on the desk by the entrance. He grabbed them without hesitation, praying they belonged to one of the vehicles inside. The first truck he tried was locked. The second, an old, beat-up Ford, opened immediately. He shoved Major inside, slammed the door shut, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life just as the black car skidded to a stop outside. The driver's side door flew open, and Kyle caught a glimpse of a man stepping out, reaching for something inside his jacket. A gun. Kyle didn't wait to see what would happen next. He threw the truck into reverse, tires screeching as he swung the vehicle around, narrowly missing the approaching man. Then, with a sharp turn of the wheel, he floored the gas and shot forward, barreling through the narrow alley leading away from the garage. The chase was immediate. The black car roared after him, its headlights flashing in his mirrors as it closed the distance. Kyle's grip tightened on the wheel as he pushed the truck harder, weaving through the back streets, forcing his pursuers to adjust their angles. He had the advantage. He knew this part of town better than they did. If he could just get enough distance, he could lose them. The truck rattled violently as he hit a rough patch of road, but he didn't slow down. Major let out a low whine from the passenger seat, and Kyle reached over, placing a steadying hand on the dog's side. "Hang in there, buddy," he muttered. He took a hard left, cutting through an old construction site, kicking up dust and debris in his wake. The black car followed but struggled on the uneven terrain, its tires skidding as the driver fought for control. That was all Kyle needed. He spotted an opening, a gap between two stacked shipping containers just wide enough for the truck to squeeze through. He took it. The moment he cleared the space, he yanked the wheel right, sending the truck onto a side street that ran parallel to the main road. The black car wasn't as lucky. There was a loud, metallic crunch as it clipped the edge of a container, the impact sending it spinning sideways. Kyle didn't stop to watch the aftermath. He kept going, pushing the truck until he was several blocks away, the sounds of pursuit fading behind him. Only when he was sure he wasn't being followed did he finally slow down, his breathing heavy, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He glanced over at Major, who was still drowsy but awake, his head resting against the seat. "You're safe," Kyle murmured, his voice low but firm. "I've got you." But as relief settled in, another thought pushed its way to the surface. This wasn't over. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to just let it go. And if they wanted a war, they had just gotten one. Kyle didn't go home. He couldn't. Not yet. He knew the moment he stepped foot back onto his property, there was a chance someone would be waiting. Whoever had stolen Major, whoever had orchestrated this whole mess, wasn't just going to let it go now that their plan had failed. They had already proven they were willing to take risks, to escalate when necessary, and after what had just happened at the garage, he had no doubt that they were desperate enough to try something even bolder. He wasn't going to give them that opportunity. He needed to regroup, reassess, and most importantly, he needed to make sure Major was okay. The truck's suspension groaned as he pulled into a deserted parking lot on the edge of town, an old gas station that had been abandoned for years. It was out of the way, no cameras, no bystanders, just a quiet, forgotten place where he could breathe for a moment. He killed the engine and turned toward Major, gently shaking the dog's shoulder. Major let out a low groan, his head shifting slightly, eyes half-lidded and unfocused. Kyle felt a fresh wave of anger rise in his chest. The sedatives were still in his system, slowing his movements, making his normally sharp gaze dull and confused. Kyle checked him carefully, running his hands over Major's ribs, his legs, his neck, searching for any signs of injury beyond the drugs they had pumped into him. There were no cuts, no broken bones, but his breathing was slightly irregular, and his reaction time was sluggish. Kyle clenched his jaw. He needed to flush the drugs out of his system, but that would take time. For now, he just needed to make sure Major was stable. His phone vibrated. Hart, Kyle exhaled before answering, his voice steady despite everything that had happened. Tell me you have something. Hart's voice was tight, serious. More than something. I traced the rental van to a shell company, fake names, fake addresses, but I dug deeper. You're not going to like what I found. Kyle already knew he wasn't going to like it, but he stayed silent, waiting. That van was rented under an account connected to a woman named Susan Lawson. Kyle's entire body went still. Lawson. Karen. He closed his eyes briefly, his fingers tightening around the phone. You're telling me Karen's involved in this directly? I'm telling you that the woman who rented that van used to work for an organization that specialized in retrieving high-value animals, specifically dogs. Expensive breeds, service animals, anything they could flip for a profit. She worked as a middleman, finding buyers, arranging transport. She wasn't just some cranky old woman with a grudge. She knew exactly what she was doing. Kyle's grip on the steering wheel turned his knuckles white. It all made sense now. The obsession, the persistence, the way she had escalated so methodically. She had never just hated Major because he was a big dog in her neighborhood. She had seen him as an opportunity, a target, something valuable she could take and sell off to the highest bidder. Where is she now? Kyle asked, his voice low. She booked a hotel outside of town an hour ago, probably figuring out her next move. Hart hesitated. Kyle, listen to me. You have what you need. The cops will handle it from here. Kyle let out a short, humorless laugh. The cops should have handled it before it got to this point. You know how this ends if you go after her alone. Kyle's jaw tightened. He did know. He knew exactly how these situations played out, but that didn't change the fact that he wasn't about to let this woman disappear before answering for what she had done. He glanced at Major again, the dog's body still sluggish, his breathing still off rhythm, and that was all the confirmation he needed. I'll call you when it's done. He hung up before Hart could argue. The hotel was a small roadside establishment, the kind of place that catered to travelers looking for a cheap stopover before heading to their real destination. The neon vacancy sign flickered weakly in the dim light of early evening, and Kyle counted 3 cars in the lot, one of which he recognized immediately. A white sedan, newer model, clean, but with a slight scratch along the passenger side. He had seen it before, parked near Karen's house. She was here. Kyle didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, keeping his head down, his steps quiet as he approached the front entrance. He didn't go through the lobby. Instead, he circled around the back, checking the rows of rooms for signs of movement. The lights in most were dim, curtains drawn, but then he saw a faint glow seeping through the heavy fabric of one of the rooms near the end of the row. He walked up to the door and knocked once. Silence. Then, the sound of movement. Kyle didn't wait. He stepped back and kicked the door in, the cheap lock snapping instantly. The moment he entered, Karen let out a startled shriek, scrambling backward, knocking over a lamp in the process. You. Where's the money, Karen? Kyle's voice was ice, controlled, but she could see it in his eyes. He wasn't here to play games. She tried to recover, straightening, forcing confidence into her tone. I don't know what you're talking about. He just broke into my room. I should call the police. Kyle didn't move, Go ahead. Call them. Let's have a conversation about stolen property. About criminal networks. About how you've been selling dogs to people who don't care if they live or die. Her mouth snapped shut. Kyle took a step closer, lowering his voice. You thought I was just going to let it go. You thought you could take Major? Sell him off, and I'd walk away. But you miscalculated, because you didn't just steal a dog. You stole my dog. And I don't let things go. Karen swallowed hard, her hands twitching at her sides. It's done, she said finally, her voice smaller now. I can't take it back. Kyle studied her for a long moment, then reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. You're going to call them. The people you were working with. You're going to tell them the deal is off. Her eyes widened. I don't care what they'll do. He took another step forward. Call them. Her breath was coming in short, shallow bursts now, panic creeping in around the edges. She looked at him, then at the phone, then back at him. She knew she had no choice. With shaking fingers, she reached for her own phone and dialed. The conversation was short, clipped, her voice barely above a whisper as she stammered out the words. The deal was off. They weren't going through with it. They weren't meeting. When she hung up, her hands were trembling. Kyle took the phone from her gently, then pocketed it. You're going to turn yourself in, he said, his voice calm. Or I'll make sure you don't get the chance. Karen stared at him, and for the first time since this whole nightmare had started, Kyle saw something real in her expression. Fear. He turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Karen didn't follow. He knew she wouldn't. The next morning, the news broke. A woman had been arrested in connection with an illegal animal trafficking operation. Kyle watched the report in silence, one hand resting on Major's back as the dog slept beside him, his breathing finally steady again. It was over. But Kyle knew one thing for certain. People like Karen always thought they could get away with it. Until they met someone who didn't let things go. The morning air was crisp, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones but kept the mind sharp. Kyle stood on his porch, a cup of black coffee in one hand, the other resting lightly on Major's back. The dog was finally himself again, his posture strong, his ears alert, his breathing steady. The sedatives had fully worn off, but Kyle knew it wasn't just the drugs that had left their mark. There had been a hesitation in Major's movements when they first got back, a brief flicker of uncertainty when Kyle had opened the truck door and called him out. It had only lasted a second, but Kyle had seen it. The dog had been taken, locked away, treated like property. He had never known captivity, never known helplessness, and that moment of hesitation had said more than words ever could. But now, standing beside Kyle as they watched the neighborhood slowly come to life, Major was whole again. He was home. The news had broken at dawn. Karen Lawson, arrested in connection to an illegal animal trafficking ring. The reports were straightforward, almost clinical, listing her involvement in orchestrating the theft and attempted sale of multiple high-value service animals, including those belonging to disabled veterans. Her connections to the larger network were still under investigation, but there was enough evidence to ensure she wouldn't be seeing the outside world again anytime soon. Kyle had stayed up most of the night going through the police report Hart had sent over. The details were exactly what he had expected. Karen had been playing the long game. Her complaints, her reports, her carefully crafted narrative about Major being dangerous hadn't just been about getting rid of him. It had been about creating a paper trail, something she could use to justify his disappearance. If anyone had asked questions, she would have claimed she had done the neighborhood a favor, that she had only intervened because authorities had failed to act. It was manipulation at its finest, a slow, methodical erosion of reality designed to make the eventual crime seem almost reasonable. Almost. Kyle wasn't the type to dwell on things, but as he sipped his coffee and listened to the distant hum of the world moving on, he allowed himself a moment to process everything. Karen had miscalculated. She had assumed he was just another man trying to escape his past, someone who would rather avoid conflict than chase it down. She had thought that a few veiled threats and an escalating series of inconveniences would wear him down, make him surrender to the inevitable. But she had forgotten one crucial thing: Kyle had spent years learning how to fight for what mattered. And when someone took what was his, he didn't let it go. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold morning air, then crouched beside Major, running a hand over the dog's fur. "It's done," he said quietly. Major let out a soft huff, as if acknowledging the words, then stretched out beside him, completely at ease. His phone buzzed. Hart. Kyle smirked to himself before answering. "Tell me you finally got some sleep," Hart said, voice laced with dry amusement. Kyle glanced at the coffee in his hand. "Close enough." "You see the reports?" "I saw them." Hart let out a low whistle. "They're painting her as some kind of criminal mastermind." She thought she was. "Yeah, well, she's in for a rude awakening. They're throwing the book at her. Fraud, theft, conspiracy, animal cruelty, you name it, she's getting hit with it." Hart paused. Not bad for a neighborhood dispute. Kyle's expression didn't change. It was never about the neighborhood. There was a moment of silence on the line, then Hart sighed. "You sure you're good?" Kyle looked out over the street, watching as a few early risers stepped outside to grab their newspapers or start their morning walks. A week ago, he would have sworn some of them were avoiding him, keeping their distance because of the rumors Karen had spread. Now things felt different. More than one neighbor had stopped by since the news broke, some offering cautious words of support, others simply nodding in quiet acknowledgement. The fear was gone. The uncertainty had been replaced with something steadier. "I'm good," Kyle said finally. Hart chuckled. "Yeah, I figured. Listen, if you ever get tired of playing house, I could always use another guy on my team. You've still got the instincts." Kyle smirked. "I'll pass. Suit yourself." Hart hesitated. "And Kyle? Yeah? You did right by him." Kyle didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. After the call ended, he leaned back against the porch railing, watching as Major shifted beside him, ears twitching at the distant sound of birds overhead. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was nothing pressing down on him, no unfinished battle waiting to be fought. Karen was gone. The people she had worked with were either on the run or already in custody. There was no loose end to tie up, no lingering threat waiting to strike. He let out a slow breath and tilted his head up toward the sky, letting the morning sun warm his skin. The fight was over. He had won, and Major was finally safe.